Hello, everyone. I'm Joey Egger. I'm the head of games here at Screen Australia. This is the Ask Me Anything Games Edition. First, I want to do an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge the various countries you're all listening from, and I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to the elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any First Nations game makers joining us today, as well as those working in the industry. Now, what's ahead is that we will quickly meet our team and we'll then give a background of games funding at Screen Australia, an overview of current funding opportunities. We'll talk about what makes a good application. We'll touch on some current trends and then as much time as possible for your questions. Okay, so let's meet the team. Let's go to the next screen. So these are my fantastic colleagues here in the games unit. Investment managers Chad Toprak, Dakoda Barker, and Goldie Bartlett, who will be here to field and answer questions. There's also a button for live caption if you need it, and this webinar will give you some info on the funds available at Screen Australia for game makers at a high level. And we will go through this quickly as we'd like to spend the majority of the time on your questions. So no question is too small. Okay, next, let's give you a bit of information about Screen Australia for those who need it. So we are the federal funding body for Australian screen content. We invest in feature films, television, online projects, and of course, games. And we also administer the producer offset, but that's not the digital games tax offset, which you might know as the DGTO. That's actually handled by the Office for the Arts. Our games funding is grant-based, and that means that we don't recoup. So if you're successful, that money is yours. We operate separately from state and territory funding bodies, but you can apply for both. And we do strongly recommend you get to know your local screen agencies as well. We speak very regularly to them, and they're awesome people, and they'd love to chat. Now, this is not the first time Screen Australia has funded games. Between 2012 and 2014, we supported studios like Defiant Development, Uppercut Games, and projects such as Assault Android Cactus and the lovely game Framed. And after that, funding was unfortunately paused. But in 2022, games funding returned to Screen Australia with the Games in Expansion Pack, and that helped over 60 projects reach release and had funding of up to $150,000 at the time. And as part of our commitments to amplify First Nation voices in storytelling through games, we supported 2 First Nation studios through the First Nations Game Studio Fund, and those studios were Guck and Awesome Black. And the success of these programs has led to games being included in the National Cultural Policy Revive, and that provides 4 years of dedicated funding for games through to January 2028. And this has allowed us to grow our team and redesign our funding programs based on your feedback, the current industry feedback. And as I mentioned, the funding we provide is actually different to the digital games tax offset. So that's administered, as I mentioned, by the Office of the Arts, and that offers a 30% tax incentive to games with a budget of $500,000 or more. And Screen Australia's current games funding offerings is for those with a budget of $500,000 or less. So I just want to give you a bit of an overview about the different funding options that we have at the moment. So the Emerging Game Makers Fund, you can apply for up to $30,000 to create a prototype or a microscale game, and it's open to both sole traders and companies. The funding is non-recoupable, and that means once you receive it, it's yours to use for the project. The Emerging Game Makers Fund exists because game makers without a prototype actually found it really difficult to access other grants at the time, and so this fund was created to fill that gap. And it's designed for early career developers, but we do take a broad view of what the word emerging means. It can include people entering the industry for the first time, those transitioning from other industries, and even experienced developers who want to branch out into their own creative practice. So if you're early in your career, or if you're moving into games from another industry, the Emerging Game Makers Fund might be something for you to look into. And just so you know, there is a 2-strike policy for declined applications. So that means you can only apply for that project one more time, but you can apply for brand new projects. The Games Production Fund. Okay, so this production fund is designed for projects that already have a playable prototype and need support to reach the next big milestone. You can apply at Screen Australia for up to $100,000, and your total project budget must be less than $500,000. Like the Emerging Games Fund, the funding is non-recoupable, and the goal is to take your game for this fund to from a prototype to a milestone that you can define. So that could be something like a vertical slice, a polished demo, or something else that can, move your game forward. Unlike the Emerging Game Makers Fund, you must be a private Australian company at the time of the application. So like a PTY Ltd. These are really easy to set up. They only take 20 minutes. You can't apply as an individual or a sole trader for this one. And to submit, you'll need a strong application that includes your milestone plan, a budget, and supporting materials. And check out the guidelines because the full details are already in there. Then we have the Future Leaders Delegation. This program supports early to mid-career underrepresented game makers to take them one step further in their journey to becoming industry leaders. It's a travel funding opportunity to attend International Games Conference that we choose each year. Earlier this year, we had it at GDC in San Francisco, and next year in May, it will be held at Bit Summit in Kyoto in Japan. It provides funds for flights and accommodation, as well as pre-departure support in the form of a workshop that we run here in Melbourne. And that brings in experts to provide tips around pitching and showcasing events and other strategic information that can help them. Members of our games team will be on the ground to support. This round is closed currently, and we'll be announcing the selected delegates in, I think, late February. But do subscribe to our Screen Australia newsletter to hear about when the next round opens up next year. To recap, just in short form, Emerging Game Makers Fund. So that's up to $30,000 for prototypes and small-scale games, for early career developers or those transitioning into games. And the next round opens 16th of December. Then we have the Games Production Fund, up to $100,000 to take a prototype to a major milestone, and for established teams with a playable prototype. And the next round opens also 16th of December. And then the Future Leaders Delegation, up to $6,000 for travel and accommodation to attend an international conference we designate, supports underrepresented game makers to attend international conferences with mentoring and showcase opportunities. And as I mentioned, this current round is closed and will open again with a date to be advised in 2026. A bit about our funding tally this year, for those that are interested. For the 2025 funding rounds to date across both Emerging Game Makers and Games Production Funds, we had a total of 204 applications with 26 approved. So, it's highly competitive. We'll announce the awarded fundees in the February Game Slate press announcement. So do stay tuned, or like I mentioned, subscribe to the latest Screen Australia updates. We wanted to give you a bit of advice on what makes a good application. So here's some tips for you. So our advice from a strong application is number one, just read the guidelines thoroughly. Most questions are actually answered in there. Check the FAQ document. We update that regularly, so all the information on there should be up to date. The trends report, which is also on the main pages for the funding options. Each one should have a trends report. They're really interesting as well as very helpful. They summarize successful and unsuccessful applications, and they highlight the do's and don'ts, which is all information that has been found from the previous rounds. I know you've heard this before, but please submit early. Don't leave it to the last minute. Please aim to admit at least a day before the deadline to avoid last minute issues. You never know what might happen to your internet connection a minute before pressing that submit button. Proofread your documents. Spelling errors and missing sentences, they do actually look unprofessional. A good thing to do would just get a second pair of eyes to read through it before you submit, if that's possible. Please reach out if you have any questions to us. We love questions. We are very happy to answer your questions. We'll have an email at the end of this talk. And also just note that the Screen Australia Games team can clarify requirements or forms, but they can't give feedback on your application. Now, here's some tips to making a strong pitch video for your applications. They're required for both the Emerging Game Makers Fund and the Games Production Fund. The video should be max 3 minutes long. Shorter is fine too, though. You have an opportunity with these videos to explain your game very clearly, but if you're not sure how, one approach to start is to begin by describing your game in just one sentence, which is like the elevator pitch, right? And once you can get that first pitch happening, then you can expand from there. Production value does not matter. iPhone phone recordings are fine. Just don't spend money on it. We don't need like high production details. We actually just want to hear from you. We want to see you, and we just want to hear your authentic story. Don't forget to be your authentic selves, as I mentioned. The reason is because your authenticity, your passion, and your enthusiasm is actually what shines through, and it's what the assessors do find infectious. They want to know about you as well. Highly recommend testing your pitch on someone unfamiliar with your game. If they can explain your game back to you, then you're on track. Another option, if you don't have anyone that you want to test it on yourself. Play it back, be really analytical, and see how you feel. In the video, we do like to see if you could show some gameplay if that's possible. Even really simple screen recordings work. So, it's up to you to see if you want to put that in, but that can often help us really get a really big overview of what your idea is about. Some things that you should not do, possibly. These are some of the things that we've found could be helpful to avoid. Do not ignore accessibility and diversity guidelines. It's actually one of our 4 assessment criteria, so make sure you're thinking about your audience and you're thinking about their needs. Do not underpay or omit any pay details in the budget. Applications with large teams and no evidence of fair compensation can get flagged, so Screen Australia requires industry standard pay. Do not submit messy budgets or timelines. When you've got like misaligned numbers or missing details or unrealistic milestone dates, they can really undermine viability. Competitive applications always show really clear alignment across all documents, and they do provide buffer time into the timeframe. Do not neglect marketing and localization plans. Really strong applications do include an early marketing strategy, competitor analysis, and also localization planning. And then the one you probably already know is don't submit buggy or unplayable builds. The assessors do want something that is not going to break and is playable, and preferably a polished representative slice that demonstrates gameplay, mechanics, and the overall feel and vibe of your game. Next, we just wanted to give you a bit of information about some current trends. So every round, we end up writing a trends report that you can access online, as I mentioned before. And if you're wanting to hear more about what makes, great applications and what to avoid, that trends report is actually a really good summary of the do's and don'ts. As an example, here's some that we pulled out for you from the latest trends report. Funding is very competitive, as you probably know. So this time around, we had a record 143 emerging Games Fund applications. For the Games Production Fund, 61 applications. That had an 18% approval rate. And I forgot to say the Emerging Games Fund applications had around a 10 to 12% approval rate. 90% of Games Production Fund projects target PC, Steam. Consoles are at about 21%. Mobile is about 18%. And good old VR is at 11%. The majority of the games are smaller teams, actually. So for the Emerging Game Makers Fund, about 80% had 1 to 3 members, and 44% were solo game makers. And for the Games Production Fund, the average team size was 3. We've also observed from a genre basis that story-driven games do remain consistently high as a genre. So that's it for the overview. I'm going to pass you over to the Q&A team so you can get your questions answered. Thank you very much.
First one on my list is, and this one we get quite often, I'm currently a student. Am I eligible for Screen Australia funding?
I can take that. I love working with students. It was what I was doing the most before I started at Screen Australia. But unfortunately, if you're currently a student, you are ineligible for our funding. This is for a couple of reasons. The first is to ensure that there's no sneaky unpaid labor happening, and the other is just a simple viability issue. It's important to us to know that you're going to have, uh, you know, ample time to focus on your studies while you're doing them, but also ample time to focus on the project if we're going to fund it. So I'm really sorry, but we have good reasons why students can't be eligible.
Next on my list is do I have to be a company to apply for games funding at Screen Australia? Do I need an ABN? Can I apply as a sole trader and then change to a company later?
For Emerging Game Makers Fund, you can be a sole trader, but for Games Production Fund, you do need to be an incorporated company, so a PTY Ltd. You can change from being a sole trader to an incorporated company at any time, and we can handle that. But yes, so the short answer is no for Emerging Game Makers Fund, yes for GPF, for Games Production Fund.
Another question regarding financing my game, what are acceptable forms of investment in the finance plan? Should I be including in-kind costs? What about deferred fees or other compensation arrangements?
We can't give you business advice, so obviously, approaching your business in the way that you want to is your prerogative. For us, we do like to see all costs listed, so including in-kind work as part of a finance plan and budget is really important for us to get a clear sense of what the project actual cost to make is, as well as any rev share agreements that you might have with your team members or as a director of your company or team. So most importantly, put the information in the finance plan and budget. That's the best way to make sure that we have the information to make the decision that is correct.
Another really common question we get is, what is a chain of title? How does it relate to development and production of independent games? And why is it a requirement for Screen Australia?
I'll take this one as well. So chain of title is basically a legal record of who owns what in relation to the project. It is really important because we're using public funding that we need to make sure that you are, from a legal standpoint, the actual entity that controls every element that needs to go into that game. This is quite important when you're working with a team that's maybe not professionalized or formalized. If you're just some mates working together, we need to make sure that there's no risk of a dispute further down the track, making that project stall entirely before we come on board to support something. So please consult with legal advice, see your solicitor or your lawyer in order to make sure those checks and those agreements are in place before you apply. It saves you a headache down the road.
What sort of information or content do you like to see in a video pitch? Should I spend the whole time talking about the game, or is it worthwhile mentioning other things?
One of the things that I really like seeing in video applications is sort of a summary or dot point version of what this funding is going to allow you to do. Often, what the video does or what the video can do is just feed back to us what the top line points of your application are, what the money's going to be used towards, what the plans are, who's on the team. Um, so yes, pitch the project, but also pitch the pitch.
Another question. The guidelines state that there's an expectation of 90% development expenditure on it that takes place physically in Australia, and that applications are required to have key creative control here as well. What does that mean in relation to having team members who are not Australian citizens or permanent residents?
I can grab this one. Um, yeah, we obviously, as a funding agency underneath the Australian federal government, it's important for our funding to be used to materially advance Australian game makers, Australian projects, etc., etc. You can absolutely collaborate with international game makers. That's not an issue, but we need the application materials to sufficiently convince us that this is an Australian project and that the expenditure and the work itself is predominantly taking place in Australia. If you are unsure about specific nuances of that, you can always reach out to the games inbox. You'll have a link to that at the end of the slides.
An example of a project that I saw recently was a small team. One of the key members of the team was an international citizen not based within Australia, but 0% of the budget that they applied to us with was going towards that person. There were other means of paying that person, which meant that it wasn't a problem.
Question from the audience. Is it better to ask for less money? Will I be more successful or competitive for funding if I ask for less?
Short answer is no. Sometimes we see people come in and we think, oh, I actually wish they'd asked for more for the full amount or for what they need. I think it's a fairly common piece of feedback that we hear is that, oh, I thought applying, asking for less would make me more competitive. It's really about asking for what you need. We do say yes to projects that ask for less money because they justify completely that that is what they need, but it won't make you more competitive.
Next question from the audience. What is a localization plan?
I'll grab this one. So a localization plan is your plan on how you will translate or localize your project to other languages and other regions. So if you plan on releasing in a language that isn't English, we want to see evidence that you know what steps are required to do that and have the capacity or the funding to secure the capacity in order to execute on that.
How detailed should the timelines be? What units of time should we be focusing on? Should we quarterly, monthly, weekly?
One of the most common pieces of feedback that I write when I'm taking notes and looking at an assessment is milestones were a little bit wishy-washy. I love detail. That might change for other people on the team, but I would say weekly units is good. If it's a long-term part of the project, you can define that it might be 2 months or 3 months worth of work, but the more detail, the better. Yeah, maybe check it with another game maker that you know to see if there's anything obvious missing. The other thing I'll say about milestones is we also really love to see time for testing or quality assurance or accessibility consultation. Especially, for example, say you've budgeted for some accessibility consultation. I need to make sure that I'm seeing that time reflected in the milestones. So if you've budgeted for it, put it in the milestones.
Could you clarify whether the timing of an application affects its likelihood of being funded? Do you review all applications after the submission deadline, or is assessment conducting on a rolling basis, potentially reducing available spots for applicants who submit later?
Once the round closes, all applications go through an eligibility check process, and then after that's complete, the games team assess every application that comes through. They're all done in one batch, so we are able to consider the full round and the context of that round. This allows everyone the equal chance. If you get your application in, you're in the same position as everybody else. We, for that reason, don't accept any updates to materials after the close of the round. That way, everyone's judged on an equitable, fair basis.
This is a quite broad question, and there might be a couple of these that are on the same sort of line. But like typically, what sort of costs should I include in my application? Can I include hardware costs, travel or presentation costs? Can I include advertising costs? What are we looking for? What's eligible and yeah, what are sort of the balancing of that?
Most things are in. I think it's pretty hard for us to give a broad statement. Don't buy a yacht as part of your finance plan is always my go-to. But if you have wages assigned and you, as the game maker, decide to use your wages to then buy a yacht later in life, go for it. That's wild. But yeah, frankly speaking, it is quite difficult for us to judge that preemptively. If there are costs associated with making the game, marketing the game, or launching the game, they're costs that we probably want to be able to support.
Going bananas on the hardware costs is often something that we would see as standing out, perhaps not in the best light, but it's tech. If you can back it up, we will discuss it when we're doing our assessments.
Is using AI, large language models, exclusively in a game acceptable?
Screen Australia has its AI guiding principles online that you can check. There are no eligibility restrictions around this at this moment, but make sure you keep up to date. It is really important to note that, as with sort of other things we've talked about, Screen Australia does require you to be able to prove chain of title, prove that you have legal control over the work that's produced as part of the grant program. Sometimes the licenses for these models can make that tricky, so best to consult legal advice before committing to using one.
Is there room for funding a game with a hardware component such as an arcade machine with a unique controller?
Our restrictions are predominantly around, is it sort of publicly available? Is it something that anyone can access? So if you're limited to a sort of bespoke custom controller or an installation piece or something like that, it may not be eligible. Yeah, I would advise reaching out to the games inbox to sort of clarify your specific situation so that we can give a more informed judgment. Yeah, it can be tricky, and I know that's often not the answer people want to hear. But please know that the games team are all super enthusiastic about this domain. It just isn't necessarily something that Screen Australia is designed to support.
I might just clarify with that one as well. If you have a look at our guidelines in the ineligible projects section, there's two components that really sort of speak to those types of games. One is projects that are not played on a digital device with a screen. That is, games that are not completely digital, including board games or hybrid digital physical games. So these are games that are not eligible. There's also another dot point about ineligible games that are business to business products. For example, training simulations, games created solely for teaching purposes, games with ties to academic research, middleware tools, or games limited to small number of locations. And I think it's that last one that really impacts physical hardware. I have a question that says, I wanted to ask about reapplications. What were some of the trends that you saw in reapplications, and what would you advise to make a really competitive reapplication?
Basically, what I was saying earlier, which is the most basic thing is to really read the guidelines and really understand what you are applying for and how it abides by those guidelines. The second thing to do is make sure that anything that you're writing is actually very clear. Every part of the application is kind of judged on different criteria, but we're also looking at the level of understanding and level of detail that you're putting into the application as well. One of the other things is really making sure that your budget is clear. As we had said earlier, having a bit of a wishy-washy budget doesn't help us understand how you're going to complete the game. Any other tips from anyone else?
Yeah, with the reapplication, certainly for Games Production Fund, we actually request, or I don't know if we request it, but we often see change logs, which tell us specifically what has changed since the last application. And that's such a handy document for us just to see specifically what kind of work has gone into the project since its last application and the quality of that work as well. And it helps to paint a sense of a lot of different things, but one is sort of I guess viability questions often is what it can come down to. Dakoda, do you have any comments on this one? What makes a competitive reapplication?
Responding to any feedback that you can access. If you are unsuccessful applying through the Emerging Gamemakers Fund, obviously we don't currently offer bespoke feedback, but engaging with the trends report, seeing what is effective and what's less effective, and reflecting on the nature of your project and figuring out which of those comments might be relevant and speaking directly to those, whether through the materials in the templates or as part of a supplementary document. These sort of direct responses to feedback sources show that you really care about sort of trying to understand and articulate where your project sits. We don't need you to implement every piece of feedback that's given. Sometimes our judgment misses a key piece of information. If you think we have misunderstood your project, don't change the feedback to incorporate what we've said, but do change your application materials to make sure that confusion is eradicated. We want to understand the project the way that you understand it, so make sure that we have everything we need to do that.
The trends reports is a great shout. We often have applications that got so close, and because we can't speak directly to them, we try to cover the specific examples of things that we saw during assessment. So strong shout to the trends reports when they're available.
The other thing I would just add is, when you're writing synopses or writing anything in your application, a really good exercise, as I think I mentioned before, is to actually just read it out loud or get someone to read it out loud. Because if you're just reading it silently, you might skip some of the things that just kind of sound a bit off. So yeah, reading it out loud, presenting it to a friend, even if it's just something that's going to be in writing to us, actually can really help you put it in your style, make it more authentically you, because we really want to hear about you and understand who you are through that application rather than it being like just professional and a bit dry.
Question here about our two funds. Could a project that's been awarded an Emerging Game Makers Fund grant also be eligible later for a Games Production Fund grant?
Yes.
Next question I have here about chain of title. If I made a game jam project with a friend and then I decide to pursue making that project into a fully fledged game on my own, is a simple written agreement between my friend and myself sufficient for the chain of title document?
It could be. I would really encourage you to talk to a solicitor to vet that the language used is all-encompassing enough to guarantee that. It obviously doesn't avoid incurring that cost, but it is better to incur an upfront legal cost than it is to incur a much, much later one at a much, much more substantial figure.
How much value does extra notes such as recommendation letters and support letters from peers or extra information like that have on an application?
It can have quite a lot, especially I think with projects that are coming down to the pointy end. They can be beneficial there. If you have access to letters of support, for example, it cannot hurt to get them. Apart from anything else, they're really nice to receive for you personally. Joey or Dakoda, do you feel differently or have any further thoughts on that one?
Yeah, not absolutely necessary, but anything that can help strengthen your proposal and your submission, things like that, also give us a, a more rounded view of yourself and your game as well. So I think they can always help, but they're not necessary.
There's a sweet spot to a lot of these things that is quite unclear. I think if you submitted an application with 400 letters of support, it might not be as effective as 10. So use your judgment about sort of how much information to provide, understanding that there is an overwhelm possibility with certain amounts of documentation. I think this is also relevant in relation to game design documents.
Right.
We see applications that submit their full game design document. That's really useful information, and as curious little nerds, I love to read them, but as far as application materials, it doesn't help as much as a tailored specific document that points out the key points.
I have one last question to ask, and then we'll have to move us on from the Q&A section of this webinar. I'm going to try and combine two questions. They relate to state government grant funding. One of them says, how does applying for and receiving state grant funding affect applications? And the other question is just about budget caps of 500K. Does that include in kind? For example, if you've received state funding with 50% matched in kind, and the in kind pushes you above that 500K threshold, how does that work?
Okay, so yeah, responding to the sort of most recent question first, in a situation where your budget between funding and in-kind work already exceeds that $500,000 cap, that would be ineligible for our funding. Unpaid work is still work. It still has a value attached to it. And our funding programs are not structured currently in a way to support projects of a scale that exceeds that. Our focus at the moment, given the resources that we have access to, is to complement the digital games tax offset, which starts for projects $500,000 and above. So in those situations, and we know there's a sort of a gray area, some overlap that isn't sort of fully covered. We are aware of that fact and always striving to address it. But yeah, in short, that project budget is $600,000 and thus would be ineligible for our funding programs at this stage. In terms of what impact does state funding provide to an application, it is generally more competitive to see other financing sources. It is generally more competitive for you to emerge through other competitive grant programs, having been successful. But this is not a guarantee of funding. We often see a difference in values and priorities and objectives between ourselves and other state and territory agencies. We're not a monolith and we have different objectives we're trying to achieve. So just having funding from one source doesn't guarantee you funding from every agency that exists, unfortunately. Would be it that we could give everyone money, but alas, it doesn't stretch that far.
We've got upcoming funding rounds. So the next round opens pretty soon, 16th of December. So get your eyes and ears and computers ready. And that closes 5th of March at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you've got any questions, feel free to email us. And finally, thank you for joining us. And as I mentioned, the email is games@screenaustralia.gov.au. Yeah, just email us with any questions that we haven't been able to answer. So thank you very much for joining. It was a pleasure to have you, and I hope you have a lovely evening and a lovely week. Thank you.